I'm Dom Nicholls and this is Ukraine the latest. Take 200 grams of sugar, a drizzle of lemon juice and 4 cups of the fruit and you can make some Wildberry jam, and that's exactly the situation Putin finds himself in this morning after 2 more Wildberry distribution centres are attacked. There is more evidence of Russia's drone safari against civilians after a market vendor in Kherson was seen being hunted by a drone. And we look at the latest diplomatic developments which have seen Kyiv's ambassador to the US dismissed and its ambassador to London say that Ukraine is unlikely ever to join NATO. And later we get the latest updates from the front line and hear what life is like today in the embattled fortress cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk and Kostiantynivka. It's Tuesday, the 4th of August, 4 years and 161 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by foreign reporter Lily Shanagher and Kyiv independent reporter Francis Farrell. We start with shocking news this morning from Kherson, where the so-called drone safari against civilians continues. Police video captured the moment a Russian drone hunted down a 52-year-old civilian market vendor. The drone took some time flying around the man's van as the vendor sought to escape before eventually detonating next to the individual. We show the full clip as the man survived, albeit wounded, with blast trauma and shrapnel injuries, we are told. The man, who has been named only as Yuri, has since gone on camera to explain what happened.
Начали разлаживаться, тут зонтик поставили, і ящики почали доставати. Там і жінка була моя. Ну, і він, ми чуємо гудить, а його навіть не видно. Він вилетів десь за ринка, ото з тих кущів і так низько пішов. Жінка почала тікати, а він почав розвертатися, і це ж над машиною. Ну, я йому показую, що дивися, овочі. А він почав на мене налітати. Ну, я почав оббігати, там, вдарив машину, і я рядом. Коротше, виходить, ми вирівнялись. І він вже вдарив, я просто впав. Потім я вже побачив, що машина. У мене там ззаді все розірване. Там все спина, голова.
Автомобіль пошкоджено також?
Так, це вже другий раз. Перший раз я до тещі їздив, вверх люкнув. Ми встигли втекти, то ми там заділили і так усі, бо більше нема на чому робити, привозить, увозить. Я його не знімав, я його не нічого. У мене взагалі часник, якщо там хорошо відео у цей, у мене там 200 члени. Я навіть йому показував, дивись колхоз, мати це. Там же бананки стоять, все там, воно навіть все двері відкриті. Він же навіть спускався. Ви бачили, коли я тікав з тої сторони, він під зон спускався. Ти ж бачив, що вже помідори стояли, якийсь огірок, там баклажани на землі стояли. Тобі ж там, там нема нічого такого.
President Zelensky said the world must see this. It must see every piece of evidence that Russia has gone mad and that its soldiers take pleasure in killing and abusing civilians. Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, said it was a barbaric Russian war crime that requires international condemnation and justice. He makes the point we have often echoed, that thousands of similar crimes never reach the public eye. He called the attack a deliberate and systemic Russian strategy, saying they know exactly what they are doing. The sadist operating this drone knows full well that he is targeting a civilian. This horrific video proves that Russian barbarians will try to repeat their genocidal atrocities of Bucha wherever they can reach. Elsewhere in Kherson, the Holy Spirit Cathedral was hit, as was a market in Odessa and residential buildings in Kramatorsk. Yesterday, 116 of 135 drones were brought down, but the remainder and 1 ballistic missile got through Ukraine's air defence. Into Russia, and 2 more Wildberries logistics hubs were attacked yesterday. One in the city of Chekhov in Moscow Oblast, located approximately 60 kilometres south of the city centre, and a second near St. Petersburg. Moscow Oblast Governor Andrei Vorobyov said several drone strikes were recorded in the Novoseliki industrial zone, which I think is the location of the Wildberries depot. He said 5 people were killed and 6 others injured in the attack, although I've seen reporting that the munitions actually missed the warehouse itself and landed in the car park. Leningrad Oblast Governor Alexander Drozhdenko confirmed on Telegram that drones had hit an unspecified warehouse in Krasny Bor, that's about 30 kilometres south of St. Petersburg city centre, but Wildberry's press service later confirmed that its facility had been struck. All of that, I think about 18 warehouses have been hit now, is possibly while Wildberries is building 2 warehouses totalling over 250,000 square metres in Kazakhstan. Novaya Gazeta says that Kazakhstani Trade and Integration Minister Arman Shakalyev announced this morning that the Russian company will build a warehouse of over 100,000 square metres near Astana, Kazakhstan's capital, and a second 160,000 square metre facility in Almaty, that's the country's largest city. Both are said to be finished by the first quarter of next year. Now, last night, a Cameroon-flagged roll-off cargo vessel was hit by a drone approximately 35 nautical miles southwest of Novorossiysk on Russia's Black Sea coast. The attack on the vessel, en route from Novorossiysk to Samsun, that's pretty much due south in Turkey, started a fire and seriously injured 3 crew. Ombre Intelligence, the global maritime risk management company, says that due to the damage, the vessel lost manoeuvrability and was disabled. The ship is called the Nadezhda, meaning hope in Russian. Next, and Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, Valery Zaluzhny, has said that Ukraine is unlikely ever to join NATO, saying the alliance's structures and doctrines are unsuited to Ukraine's modern battlefield experience. The remarks came during a discussion on Euro-Atlantic integration at a general gathering of ambassadors in Kyiv, according to European Pravda. He urged Kyiv to pursue alternative security guarantees, including closer cooperation through the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, or JEF, and potentially a future European security bloc. It's worth noting, of course, that JEF, the 10-nation defence-focused grouping of northern European nations, does not have a mutual defence clause akin to NATO's all-important Article 5, where an attack against one is deemed to be an attack against all. Mr. Zaluzhny said Ukraine still needs advanced NATO technologies, particularly missile defence and space capabilities, adding, "I know NATO very well. For roughly 12 years, I've personally worked on mastering NATO standards, and every year I've listened to the same fairy tale that we're about to join." Next, an US ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, has effectively kiboshed the possible Patriot missile production deal for Ukraine. Speaking to Fox News, he said, "We do not allow anybody but US manufacturers to make those in the United States." So that's pretty clear then. He said export controls mean only US manufacturers currently produce PAC-3 interceptors, while stressing the immediate priority is accelerating deliveries of existing air defence systems before winter. All fair points, but probably known to the administration last week when President Zelensky had his ears stroked in the White House. For the record, I don't think this licensing plan is going to happen, and even if anything similar does come along, it will mirror the process in Japan, whereby Patriot missiles are made under license, but the really sensitive parts arrive pre-built from the United States, and Japanese nationals just incorporate them into the weapon. This is the so-called black box approach. Anyway, Mr. Whitaker went through the performative motions of pretending to sound like the bountiful cup of White House assistance for Ukraine overfloweth by saying, "I don't think anything has changed. I mean, first, remember, air defence is a multi-layered, multi-dimensional situation. The most important thing right now is that the air defence Ukraine needs to survive winter is moved as quickly as possible, whether that's from our allies who have extra missiles or whether that's producing more in our own factories. Long-term production deals are not going to be ready by this winter." Now, speaking of the Kama winter battle, and Ukrainian Energy Minister Denis Shmyhal says Ukraine and Russia are engaged in a battle to cripple each other's energy infrastructure, with the outcome likely to shape future peace talks. In an interview with Politico, which I should make clear for transparency is a sister media organisation to the Telegraph now that we've been bought by Axel Springer, Mr. Shmyhal said Russia aims to destroy Ukraine's energy, water and industrial capacity before winter, while Ukraine is targeting Russian oil refineries to increase pressure on Moscow. Mr. Shmyhal said Kyiv urgently needs additional Patriot PAC-3 interceptor missiles and funding to strengthen energy resilience, including protecting infrastructure and restoring gas supplies. He added Ukraine is preparing for another difficult winter, but remains confident it can withstand renewed Russian attacks. Putin wants to finish off our energy system and derail our economy and weapons production, Denis Shmyhal said. It's like the 12th round, and each boxer hopes their rival will fall first. Then, in a rather telling statement, he said Russians have destroyed or damaged more than 80% of Ukraine's power generation. It's worth noting that before 2014, Ukraine generated 54.5 gigawatts of electricity. The full-scale invasion cut that to 32 gigawatts. This year, after Russia's winter attacks, Ukraine's energy production was only about 12 gigawatts. Now, over to the diplomatic front. Lily, welcome back to the podcast. Where do you want to start on the diplomatic front?
Thanks for having me on. Let's start in Washington, where Kyiv's ambassador to the US has been dismissed. This is Olha Stefanishina. This move has been expected for quite a few weeks after Zelensky's controversial government reshuffle, after which the ambassador herself requested to be relieved of her duties. Stefanishina said she had requested to leave the post for personal reasons, although according to Ukrainian media, she is also under investigation by the country's anti-corruption agency on suspicion of wrongdoing. We should stress, though, that she has not formally been charged with anything. In her resignation letter, Stefanishina described her appointment as the greatest honour of her life. She's worked through some turbulent times in the relationship between Ukraine and Washington, and she herself said her team had helped to secure continued US weapon supplies despite the changing political climate in Washington. We've obviously seen Trump oscillate between support and really holding back from providing aid to Kyiv. And she said that she took it from a country that receives aid to one that attracts investment and trade opportunities. Ukrainian media has reported about these investigations. She's been investigated by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau in connection with alleged irregularities involving the Asset Recovery and Management Agency, although, as I say, she's not been formally charged. So Ukrainian media previously reported that companies linked to her former husband had received contracts to manage seized assets. She was also charged in a separate embezzlement case in 2019. There was plans by Zelensky to appoint recently dismissed Prime Minister Yulia Sviridenko to become the next ambassador to Washington, but Ukrainian media said that she hadn't agreed to the offer. And so there's been a bit of a blow to his plans, and it's as yet undecided who's going to take Stefanishina's place.
So we don't know where she's going. She's not been announced where she's off to, or any position in this sort of government reshuffle. We just know that she's leaving as US ambassador.
Yeah, well, it comes on a day of a lot of dismissals. Zelensky also dismissed Ukraine's ambassadors to Brunei, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Austria and Libya, according to a decree published on the website of the presidential office.
So Ms. Stefanishina said it was the honour of her life to serve as US. Strange. I mean, I'd interviewed her, so I'm surprised that didn't get a mention. Anyway, never mind. It's up to her.
Maybe that was in the longer spiel. I didn't include.
Maybe.
We're going to do yet more swaps. Zelensky has also appointed former Defence Minister Rustem Umerov as head of Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service as part of a wider reshuffle of the country's wartime leadership that he's been doing for quite some time now. Umerov leaves his role as Secretary of the National Security and Defence Council, and Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko is going to take over that position. This follows Zelensky's July announcement that Ukraine needed more strength in its security leadership. In this position, he's going to be overseeing diplomacy, defence, negotiations with Washington and other partners, and, of course, peace talks. And he'll be working on the EU-Ukraine drone deal. Next, we have a strange kind of spat between Iran and Ukraine. The senior Iranian advisor, Mohsen Rezai, claimed that Iran had prepared 3 strikes on Ukraine after Kyiv was accused back in July of attacking an Iranian commercial vessel in the Caspian Sea. But he said he decided to cancel the operation after Ukraine apologised.
So this is the vessel that allegedly was carrying Iranian drones to Russia that somebody, because no one's ever taken responsibility, but it's thought Ukraine hit and sunk, or at least badly damaged. So that's this, and then that led to Iran throwing its toys out the cot and threatening fire and brimstone on Ukraine. And the whole thing's been dismantled just by an apology.
Yeah, so this was back on July 25th. And as you say, it was an attack on a vessel transporting military cargo with limited evidence. And Iran said that this was an act of aggression. It could not go kind of unpunished. But there's been a big turnaround after a call between Andriy Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, and Tehran, and during which he apparently urged Tehran not to escalate tensions and said that the strike was unintentional and he never wanted to attack civilians.
I didn't mean to laugh. Unintentional strike just happens to hit the ship in the Caspian Sea.
Accidents happen.
What are the chances?
Whoops. And of course, there have been some very strained relations between Iran and Ukraine because, Russia has Shanagher drones.
Yes. You've been studying the diplomatic beat for a long time. Strained relations is probably a fair assessment. Now, take us to Paris, or somewhere near Paris, because she's gone on holiday, hasn't she? The lady that Adelie gave us an update on last Friday. Russia today, Paris, holidays. What's going on?
Yes, so we have an update on Xenia Fedorova, who has been ordered to leave France, as Adeli has been, covering. But just to rejig your memory, she is a Russian television commentator who used to work for the state-run Russia Today, RT channel. She was working on it in France until it was banned during the full-scale invasion in 2022, but she's continued to spread pro-Russian sentiment.
From France?
From France,
right,
from
okay.
Paris, from the capital. And it came to a head where she was expelled last week and her assets were frozen. Fedorova lodged an appeal, but she's failed to show that being ordered to leave the country would have, quote, serious personal consequences, which would be the requirement for the Parisian Administrative Court. She, of course, intends to challenge that again, her lawyer said. And then in a further twist, despite being technically under house arrest since Wednesday, according to French media, she is apparently on holiday and she's refusing to return to France until the deportation order has been suspended or cancelled.
So hang on, so she's is it like COVID? She's gone on holiday to a bathroom or something for a couple of days and just, she's actually gone on holiday even though she's under house arrest?
She's away and her lawyer said that she's not going to come back until this whole thing is put to bed.
And she's claiming that if she goes back to Russia, she'd be under serious personal threat, and that's why she's got to stay in Paris.
Yeah, so that would be the kind of litmus test to prove whether one should stay or one should be deported.
Right.
And the administrative court said that she was not able to prove that.
What evidence can she come up if she's a mouthpiece for? If she was in RT, and she's carried on the pro-Kremlin information
and she's
flank.
Been having a spat since about 2019 with Macron and a number of other ministers. Jean-Noël Barrot has called her an influence agent, and Laurent Nunez has accused her of relaying Russian propaganda to undermine the fundamental interests of the nation, whilst Fedorova and her supporters claim that she's a victim of state censorship and an attack on freedom of speech. I think the important thing is that she is propped up by Vincent Bolloré, who is this conservative right-wing media baron, and he has basically been taking over these French newsrooms and instilling this sort of ultra-Catholic, pro-Kremlin viewpoint. And as we reach the French elections next year, it seems that the authorities are quite keen to stifle that influence that could encourage and animate the far right.
Saldaban, Lily. Now, she's not the only person who's been trying to shift countries. What's the next chap we're going to be talking about?
Yes, she may be swapping places with Russian opposition politician Boris Nadezhdin, who has announced he's left Russia for Paris after being designated a foreign agent. Nadezhdin says he is now, quote, alive and free in Paris. He unsuccessfully sought to challenge Vladimir Putin in the 2024 presidential election on an anti-war platform, and he has been quite a well-known opposition politician. He was later barred from standing in September's parliamentary elections following the designation. He then decided to run in the 2026 parliamentary elections, but that's when it came to head. He was declared a foreign agent on July 10th. And 3 days later, he was charged with displaying extremist symbols because of a link to a video featuring a photograph of Alexei Navalny. He was fined 1,000 rubles and given the foreign agent and extremist charges, which barred him from running. He says the accusations against him, including displaying extremist symbols, were unfounded.
Thanks, Lily. Interesting. I wonder how he managed to get out of the country. If he's on whatever list he was on in Russia, I'm surprised he's able to take a commercial flight or get out of the country somehow. Anyway, we will find out one day. I don't know. Do please stay where you are. I want to pick your Central and South American brains a bit later about Russia's waning influence there. So hang around for final thoughts if you can. But delighted now to turn to our friend and colleague at the Kyiv Independent, Francis Farrell. Francis, welcome back to Ukraine the Latest. Always a pleasure to see you and chat to you. You've been a busy boy. You've been out and about. I'd love to hear about your recent reporting visit to the front line. But first, what's the mood like today in Kyiv? What's happening where you are?
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Great to be back. It's been an intense summer, but which summer in this war hasn't been intense? So it feels like that doesn't mean much. Here in Kyiv, we're fine for now. Sun's shining. Summer in Kyiv is beautiful. We did have a pretty bad attack just a few days ago, and that has just been a succession of basically weekly mass attacks where the focus is, of course, using ballistic missiles, and where most of them tend not to be shot down. Now it's usually 0, 1, 2, maybe 3 of them that get shot down in one go, and then you've got the Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles on top of those. And so, I mean, it is a new kind of reality where, if we teleport back to maybe a year ago, we thought, it's actually fine in Kyiv. Yes, there are attacks, but it's everyone calls it, the best defended city in the world. But now you do feel very vulnerable when that attack starts, because you understand that the first hits might come before the siren even rings, and then once it starts, then most people maybe don't feel safe trying to go to the shelter in that time. I tend to just hide in the corridor. My cat prefers to go under the bed, but then you wake up the next day and it's a beautiful summer's day in Kyiv, so like it's been always.
And just before I ask you about your trip the last couple of weeks, and focusing in on the Donbass more particular, what's your reaction to this video out today of this the continuing drone safari in Kherson? We've covered it quite a lot, but it doesn't get a huge amount of coverage in the Western media unless and until there's some dramatic imagery, such as today of this chap, this market trader, being chased around his van by a drone. Thankfully, he survived. But I mean, what is your reaction in the country? Because you're seeing this every day.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for putting that at the top of your program today. I think it's important, because I would totally agree with you that it is, if you compare it to all the different war crimes, maybe Bucha, Olenivka, or a single strike here or there, it's a kind of one quick decision that was made by some undeniably evil people, then carried out by undeniably evil subordinates, but it just kind of happened. Whereas when we're talking about the human safari in Kherson, it is not only one of the most evil and cynical kind of war crimes you could imagine, but it happens every day, and it has done for 2 years now. I was down there in November last year, with a focus on exactly that. We spent about 3 or 4 days in Kherson, and of course what makes Kherson different to any other city in Ukraine is that it's a large city, it's a provincial capital, but it's so deep inside this kill zone. It's so close to the Russians, and so it's most of the population center is in range of all of their drones, and the Russians pretty much every day they fly over. Sometimes maybe it's lesser experienced pilots training and just training to hit vehicles, training to hit people, and then heading off to Donbass to do that on the battlefield, or they're trying to hit some military targets, and if they can't find anything, they just decide they hit whatever, but the end result is the same. And it's worth remembering that sometimes they even upload these videos of them hunting clearly civilian targets themselves. So we were there, we spoke to victims of such attacks. I saw in front of my eyes a civilian car that had been blown up just an hour before by a Russian drone. And so, it's just one of those things. And it's also a response to anyone who says that this is Putin's war and not Russia's war. And there's not something, fundamentally evil going on with the rank and file of the Russian military and the country that is kind of basically supporting this. This is just done by ordinary Russians who were signed up to the army, learned to fly drones, and then started doing this in Kherson. There's nothing strange about it. It's just pure evil.
Now, as you say, Kherson is a provincial capital, so there's thousands of civilians there, and they are very clearly in range of these first-person view drones. I take it this would be a fibre optic controlled drone, you think, that's doing this, the way it was manoeuvring and clearly being controlled?
So it seemed in the video that it had the fiber optic spool underneath, which would be evidence that it was. I know that at first they were kind of struggling to use them in Kherson because the river kind of got in the way, and if the cable actually landed in the river itself, that could obviously short circuit or break. But then what they were telling me, the soldiers who were dealing with these drones, there are soldiers whose whole job is to defend this city from these drones, whether it's through electronic warfare, building nets, the mobile fire groups. They were saying that they were using the ruins of the old bridge that is now destroyed as basically a line across which they would kind of lay out the fiber optic cable and then be able to head into the city.
Now, the fact is fibre optic, unlike many other places up and down the line, which is devoid of civilian life largely, this fibre optic cable, because it spools out the back, it will lay on the floor, lay on the trees and on the fences and all the rest of it. Now, the Ukrainian government advice is for anyone coming across this is to not to cut the wire, because then they say it may detonate the drone, which could be in very close proximity to them. But when you're in something like a city, do you know of people that must come across things like that? And obviously, Ukraine isn't using fibre optic controlled FPV drones inside a city like Kherson. So, and people you've spoken to down there, is there a feeling that they want to? Are people cutting these cables because they know that at the end of it there's going to be a drone somewhere?
I haven't heard of civilians doing it themselves. I'm sure it has come up. Back when I was there, it was when they were only starting to use the fiber optic in Kherson, again because of the river. In general, I mean, the thing about cutting the cable, obviously, that you're also seeing all of the cables from all of the previous fiber optic drones that have flown around in the area. And that's probably one of the main themes of my recent trips to Donbass, to areas of very high intense fighting, where the Russians are using way more fiber optics than they are in Kherson, is that these cables are everywhere. And so the chance that if you see a random cable, that is belonging to a drone that's being flown this very minute is pretty low, I guess. But I'm sure it does happen.
Now, you mentioned the Donbass, so you're on a recent reporting trip there. Take us into the area, please, and in particular the fortress belt cities. We've reported for a while now that there's been very little move along the line. What move there has been, and it's in a very chaotic fashion, but it seem to be down the south of the fortress belt around Kostiantynivka. But what can you tell us about the battlefield update from the Donbass?
I think it's worth doing a little bit of a refresher and putting the battle for the Donbass that we see now in context of the whole strategic picture. Of course, when we're talking about the overall Russian monthly gains along the front line, that people like Deep State, OSINT Group is measuring, that has dropped significantly since last, compared to this time last summer, compared to this time the previous summer. And there is a feeling that Russian forces are moving a lot slower all across the front line. Having said that, though, their main priority and the main area where we do still see them moving forward is Donbass, specifically this kind of small piece of Donetsk region. It's about a fifth of it, depending on how you measure it, that Ukraine still holds. And of course, this is the same piece of land that was at the center of all of the arguments about peace talks last year. With Washington genuinely thinking that they could convince Ukraine to just hand this over in exchange for a promise of a Russian peace deal. And Ukraine is clearly not doing that, not only because there were still hundreds of thousands of their own people there, not only because the promise of a peace deal from Moscow was a ridiculous concept at first, but also because this was some of the most heavily fortified land in the world. And when we talk about the fortress belt, we talk about 4 cities, which are basically in a line along one road. So starting with Sloviansk in the north, Kramatorsk, which is the biggest out of the 4, then the third one, the city of Drushkivka, and then the fourth one, as you mentioned, Kostiantynivka. And right now, I mean, it's been understood that Ukraine's just not going to give this over because it's going to cost Russia so much in terms of blood, in terms of metal, in terms of money and time to actually take this by force, that is what could actually drain their resource and their conviction to continue the war at all. So the battles there have remained very, very fierce. And now we've reached a point where some of these cities like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, which normally felt safe, are now being touched by the war more and more often. And it's almost a kind of gradual progression. So Sloviansk is probably the safest one. That's where, you still have cafes open, you still have people playing in the streets with their children. And then Kramatorsk, in just the recent months, is where things have really, I think, declined in the last few months. And one of the most extraordinary things, just to maybe spoil a story that we've got coming out later in the Kyiv Independent, is that I was in this park in Kramatorsk looking at this big Ukrainian flag that they've got there since 2015. Big, beautiful, impressive flag. It fills you with the idea that, this is Ukraine. And I heard some gunshots and ringing out in the area, which usually means someone's trying to shoot down a drone in the area. It was just small arms fire. And within about 15 seconds, I see a little black dot flying towards the flag. And it, of course, was an FPV drone right in front of me that was heading straight for the flag itself. And sure enough, it hit the flag. It blew a great big hole in the middle. And that just gives you an idea of what the danger is, kind of right everywhere you go in that city. It's a huge city, and it's still, possible to move around. If you're on foot, you're probably fine. If you're on a vehicle, you want to be careful not to park it, anywhere out in the open. And some, and plenty of people, businesses are still kind of holding on, but they've been closing recently. The third city down the line is Družkivka, where I was just under a month ago. And now that the situation there has gotten markedly worse, almost all remnants of civilization, almost all shops have left, closed down at that point. There were still a lot of civilians kind of shuffling around from one basement to another. But here is the kind of area where you've got drones, but you've also got a lot of glide bombs, these, kind of unstoppable, brutal Russian weapons that they just use to raze cities to the ground so they can then take the ruins. Of course, Ukraine does have drone positions in that city, and it's just this kind of huge and unwieldy hammer that the Russians are using on Družkivka. And then finally, just a bit further down the road, and we walked down the road and didn't make it there because it was already contested, is the city of Kostiantynivka. And this city is now completely contested, I think, all across the urban area. It's been the subject, just like Pokrovsk was, and other cities before that. It's been the topic of a lot of discussion, both sides trying to raise flags to show that they're still controlling it. But in reality, it's, I think, maybe the best example at the moment that we have on the front line of how blurred the front line really is at this point, how difficult it is to actually draw such a line or even, color one area as being controlled by one side or the other. And just to give you an example of what that looks like, that looks like the fact that we have reports of Russian soldiers, walking all the way through the city, sneaking through the kill zone that exists of Ukrainian drones, and even making it to the next settlements, further in the direction of Družkivka. But meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers still hold positions deep inside the city, and so they're doing their own little sneaky rotations through the city to rotate those infantry that are still holding positions inside. And so if you were to map these positions, and we don't have a perfect map of them, but we do have from open sources videos from both sides' drones of where they're hitting each other. If you map these hits and geolocate them, you can see that the front line is just completely fragmented and completely overlapping on both sides. So sometimes, depending on which map you look at, it might seem that Kostiantynivka has been completely overrun or taken by the Russians, but it's really the perfect example of the modern kind of urban gray zone. So once they take that, and which probably is just a matter of time, but could still last for many months, then they'll be in a position to move on to the city of Družkivka. And then after that, if, and I say if, not when, if they overcome that, then there are these still huge fortress cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk to overcome. And that's just talking about the fortress belt of Donetsk region, and there's still a lot more area to conquer. So, it could still be a matter of years, even though now this is probably the only main real Russian angle of attack where they're concentrating most of their forces.
I want to ask you about changes at the top of the tree, the politics, and also the head of the armed forces in a moment. And I know Lily's got a question for you, but just before we move off from this, in your recent visit there, what was morale like amongst the civilians and the soldiers you spoke to?
Well, I think civilians, as the situation gets worse, they see what's coming. That's the good thing, I guess, for them, safety-wise and decision-making-wise, is that they now have a very, very clear blueprint of what happens to their cities when, first the glide bombs start arriving, then the FPVs, and then more and more FPVs, and then civilization starts to disappear. They lose utilities, electricity, water. And at that point, most of them have made some plans and they leave. We were talking to business owners that were trying to work until, the very last moment that it was possible, but they were already, moving all of their stuff out to Western Ukraine. The same thing still happens, that, they're holding on to the last moment. It's very difficult for them to really stomach leaving their home, especially if they've grown up here, if they've got family buried there. And unfortunately, the support given for internally displaced people by the Ukrainian state is still completely woeful, to be honest. And so there is this really feeling that they'll be completely on their own. They'll be basically homeless with really miserly benefits, and no one really to help them if they don't have a support network. So in that sense,
you're talking transport, housing, and some sort of grant of money, are you?
Yeah, especially the housing. That's the trickiest thing. If they can find that and there is work, then maybe there's a future for them. But of course, we're talking about a lot of people of pension age, and the phrase that you hear a lot from these people is that no one wants us. We're not useful to anyone, and so and that's the feeling they get. It's very sad. It's sad that more has not been done to fix that. As for soldiers, I think soldiers, again, they have better clarity than anyone else about what it would mean to give up now, to kind of let go. They're in this kind of death grip, physically, mentally. They of course are exhausted, they're burnt out, they want to go home, but more than anyone, they understand what it would mean if they were to just go home, and that's that is what pushes them forward. I think they have been definitely boosted by all of the long-range strikes. You hear them, talking about, even though it seems very distant from their world, where they're still getting hammered by drones and glide bombs, they talk about the strikes inside Russia on Crimea, and there is a little bit of a general feel of optimism compared to a year ago.
Just wanted to go back to what you were talking about earlier, about this not being just Putin's war, but being, a wider, systemic abuses taking place against Ukraine. Is this something, where do you think this hatred is coming from, especially in the older generations? We're seeing growing indoctrination and propaganda in Russian schools, for example. But what has created this hate before these mass indoctrination kind of programs in schools were being ramped up? And therefore, with these programs, do you see further violence increasing if this war should increase into the next few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I agree that it's almost a different question depending on the generation. I think the older generation are almost because they tend to consume television, which has been extremely toxic in its hatred for Ukrainians and the West for a long time, for over 10 years now. They're almost the worst when it comes to that. Young people is a different question. I once asked an exiled Russian regional journalist from the north of the country about, whether I think whether he thinks that there'll be manpower issues, there'll be a need to mobilize, which is a whole separate topic. But and he said, I just don't think the war will end until Putin dies, because after a while he'll just have a steady flow of indoctrinated young people coming up from the school systems. But speaking about the motivations, I also visited a POW camp a month ago. It was the same one, I think, that Dom visited, that they tend to take journalists to. So I don't want to rehash a lot of that, but I think there's, just my kind of surface level impressions from my conversations with these Russian soldiers, and I actually wanted, especially to speak to the younger ones, was that they're just, they're just empty of the kind of moral fiber, and that is because of their upbringing, often coming from these depressed areas of Russia. And they just see it as a pragmatic decision. This is, makes sense for me money-wise to go sign up. Once we do that, well, then that's the order. We need to go forward. We need to, move forward. And they don't, the moral question of what their country is doing just does not even enter their head.
Could I sort of lift us up a little bit now, talk at the sort of strategic level, up to the politics? Firstly, we've had a question from a listener who asked what do you think the end goal of these attacks on Crimea are? Thank you for that question. What do you think is happening in Crimea and why? And then lifting it up to the recent changes at Defence Minister level, Fedorov, getting Drapati in there, General Syrsky being moved out, etc., etc. So can you talk to us from the strategic level? What does that look like from where you are?
Yeah, so on Crimea quickly, I mean, it's obviously a little bit more complicated than this, but to reduce it to the baseline, on one hand, you have a very practical need to hit valuable targets, to cut off logistics lines in this important part of occupied Ukraine, which has been used as a logistics hub, as a base, as a place to kind of gather forces, and that does have a tangible impact on the front line. It's hard to measure that tangible impact because the front line, doesn't quite run through that part of southern Ukraine. But just imposing costs on Russia, with the attacks on air defense systems, on refineries, on navy infrastructure. But if we're talking about Crimea specifically, what we're talking about more is a kind of asymmetric, offensive, strategic, political kind of campaign, basically trying to impose costs on the kind of pride of Russia's imperial and Putin's imperial project in Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, to the point where it becomes part of the reason why he might decide to wind his war down, which is what we all want, of course, especially those here in Ukraine. And that, in many ways, I'm a firm believer in the fact that, unfortunately, even someone who's gone through the traditional kind of Russia studies education, unfortunately, the study of Putin and his psychology is almost more important sometimes than a kind of dry geopolitical study of Russia and its interests and its culture. And one example of that is that ultimately, it's going to be his decision whether to, with all of these new costs kind of mounting, whether it's logistics, whether it's Crimea, whether it's Wildberries, whether it's the economy in general, it's going to be his choice to either, or the manpower problem for Russia, to either wind down the war or double down. And the clearest example of this is going to be mobilization. He has clearly really been reluctant to do this, but now he's not only pushed towards that direction because of the losses on the battlefield, but he's clearly sowing the seeds for that, setting up electronic registers, employing people who are going to be dealing with mobilization. And so in that sense, unfortunately, if we do see him take the double down route, then the political pressure from Crimea, it might not have been enough, but then we enter a new world. We enter a world where the war could last years longer, but the costs for Russia will just keep mounting, and they could actually overextend, which could be valuable for Ukraine, but the costs for Ukraine will also mount.
And just briefly, if you would, because we are getting a little short on time, the changes at the top of the Ukrainian political and military structure. The protests are still going on, aren't they? But Fedorov, he was seen to be slightly soft on the draft or mobilisation himself. What's your take on the recent changes there?
So the last protest, the last really big protest was on Friday, and I think clearly with a movement like this, where everyone's busy, everyone's in wartime Kyiv, it's hard to maintain the pressure of a daily protest, and the urgency of it has dropped a little bit now that it's not clear, now that Tripathi has been brought in, and Syrsky, who was a big part of the problem, he was like the anti-Fedorov, was removed. But now they're still pushing for this. There was this interview that came out last week where he kind of opened up a little bit more about his understanding of the reasons. And that's where this big question really comes in. Like, what was the real reason? Because at first Zelensky said that it was the conflict with Syrsky, but now if Syrsky's gone, then what's the problem? And now what Fedorov has said, and what a lot of people have talked about, is that the conflict, that the decision came after a lot of very influential and powerful people who were making money from procurement schemes in the defense ministry were kind of pressuring the president to basically giving him an idea that there was something wrong with Fedorov, that he was not doing a good job, and then they could really jump on anything, whether it was kind of disillusionment with him among generals, among commanders, this or that he's not doing right. And one of the things that I think was being said in these hypothetical kind of discussions was the fact that he wasn't succeeding to reform mobilization. And it's kind of absurd to even think about that when mobilization is the thing that the president hasn't wanted to touch for years, and that other defense ministers who've been a lot longer in the job have likewise avoided touching, and basically allowed the system to degenerate into a place where the actual drafting of people on the streets, which is conducted not by the defense minister but by the ground forces, by the military, and then importantly how those people are used, how those people are divided between units and sent and used on the battlefield, is also controlled by the military, and all the politicians, all the bureaucrats are avoiding it. And Fedorov said in his interview that he had a plan. There were things that were meant to start happening in July that have now been derailed because of this. So this was always going to be at the core of this mobilization. The manpower crisis was always the biggest kind of internal problem for Ukraine going forward, especially in a war that could last for years longer. But Fedorov, maybe not every decision he was making around it was perfect, but he was one of the first people to actually try and take responsibility for it and deal with it himself.
Thanks, Francis. Please do stay there if you have time, because I want to hear all about the event that you've got planned. And I should just say thank you to Stuart for that question about Crimea. Thank you, Stuart. Lily, by way of final thoughts, if I may pick your final thoughts for you, apologies, but I had a question from Federico, a Colombian British citizen living in Miami, asking about Central South America. So, yes, I was interested when I saw this, and so I thought, well, I need to speak to Lily about that because I haven't got a clue. So, what's happening vis-a-vis Russia's influence, waning or otherwise, rise of China in terms of influence, US in Central and Southern America? Federico's asking about how developments in Latin America may form part of the wider geopolitical contest.
Yes, so the main point is that we've seen in recent months and just under a year, really a blue tide of elections. And so that's replacing the pink wave of the early 2000s. We're seeing a lot of right-wing governments winning the elections, and a lot of them are promoting, tough on crime message, greater security, cutting social funding, and most importantly, stronger relations with the US. These governments have come into power, partially because these countries are sick and tired of left-wing established governments unable to grasp control of crime that does seem to be ballooning in most of the states. But we can't undermine the strength of US influence in these countries. So, for example, let's take Colombia, Abelardo de la Espriella, he's going to be inaugurated on the 7th. He has promoted a stronger US partnership. And if we go to November, the kind of end of this tide will be clinched if Flavio Bolsonaro, who is another Trump ally, wins over Lula, who is the current leftist incumbent in the country. This has been great news for the US, who under Trump and his Donroe doctrine has sought to expand power and influence in the Western Hemisphere and almost see these countries as their right. This is their territory, that they should have, priority security, priority trade agreements, priority influence. It's very bad news for Russia, who's already seen a waning influence in the region since the loss of Venezuela and, the strangling of Cuba. And Russia has sought to expand its ties with Latin American countries, and this dates back to the Soviet Union times, where they have sought to become the anti-US power that many leftist governments have gone to. But now that they lost Venezuela earlier this year, which was one of their strongest allies, and Cuba has become all but totally diminished thanks to US sanctions, they really only have Nicaragua left in the region that will kind of do their bidding, which is largely security-based. They run a lot of intelligence networks. They share a lot of weapons and arms imports with the countries. And in turn for the money that Russia provides, they get a foothold at the base of the USA. And so we're going to see in the upcoming months stronger ties with China, who largely wants to promote trade agreements, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, and expanding its and increasing its trade with Brazil. But we're probably going to see Russia kind of pulling out. And that's partly because Russia has proven itself to be such a bad partner, as we saw with Syria and as we saw Venezuela, and kind of to an extent Cuba. It's clear that Russia is so preoccupied on Ukraine, it will not step up to defend its allies. And as a result, it's going to lose influence in a very strategic region below the US.
Losing influence to US and
the
China.
The USA, yeah. China kind of goes behind the scenes. They're very good at kind of staying out of the big media arguments and storms, whereas the USA is louder, all the while quietly strengthening these trade agreements. For example, China, despite Javier Milei's posturing at being very pro-US, he still has a lot of trade with China. And China is Brazil's largest trade partner, and Brazil is the largest economy, which is partly why Trump wants it so badly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lily, and thanks, Federico, for writing in. Francis, final thoughts. Please tell us about your upcoming event.
Instead of saying anything else that's trying to be eloquent, I'll just, very happily announce that the Kyiv Independent is coming to London for the second event of its kind. We're trying to do more of these offline events in cities where we know we have a lot of supporters and members. We did one in New York, which was great back last year. And now I think finally, much overdue, we're coming to London. It's going to be on the 2nd of October. Myself, Chief Editor Olga, and some other people in our team are going to be there. We're going to have a live story night, Q&A, and all kinds photo exhibition from a Ukrainian war photographer, and all kinds of other things. We will probably have an extended program, so we're still trying to plan some more different things, events and meetings, and I'll definitely hope I'll be back in the new studio to join you guys. But in the meantime, do check out our event, and if you feel like, and if you'll be in London, then buy a ticket.
Brilliant. Thanks, Francis. 2nd of October. Right, keep us updated on where, when and how and all the rest of it. But thank you for joining us today, Francis. Always a delight to speak to you. Please look after yourself and give the team our best wishes. We do refer to you a lot on the podcast. We cite you, obviously, wherever possible, but we think about you guys a lot. So please pass on our best wishes to the wider Kyiv Indie team. Lily, thanks for your company today. We'll be back again tomorrow, folks. Same time, same place. Thanks for your company. But from the Telegraph newsroom here in London, I wish you all a very good afternoon.